Seattle's story as a built environment begins, not with grand ambition, but with pragmatism. Founded in 1852 on a narrow isthmus between Puget Sound and Lake Washington, the city's early character was shaped entirely by geography and commerce. The Duwamish people had inhabited this region for centuries before a European settlement. But the arrival of European and American traders and settlers transformed the landscape. The city's location, a natural harbor with deep water access, made it an ideal port for logging operations that would dominate the Pacific Northwest. This simple geographic fact would dictate the city's earliest architectural priorities: warehouses, mills, and simple wooden structures built quickly to serve the logging trade. The architectural character of frontier Seattle reflected necessity over aesthetics. In 1889, a devastating fire swept through much of the downtown district, destroying wooden buildings that had been hastily constructed in the decades prior. This catastrophe, while destructive, created an unexpected opportunity. As the city rebuilt, there was a shift toward more permanent materials. Brick and stone began to replace wood as the preferred construction medium for commercial buildings. Local builders and architects responded to the rebuilding effort with practical designs. Influenced by late 19th century commercial styles, the result was a compact downtown core of solid masonry buildings, many of which still stand today. They are heavy Romanesque and Victorian forms, marking the boundary between Seattle's earliest era and its establishment as a more substantial city. The early 20th century brought prosperity through continued resource extraction and maritime trade. This period, roughly from 1900 to 1920, saw the emergence of what historians recognize as Seattle's commercial architectural tradition. The city's business district expanded with multi-story commercial buildings designed to maximize floor space for retail and office use. These structures typically featured large ground-floor windows for shops, with repetitive window patterns on upper floors. Architectural historians note that these designs reflected the practical economics of urban real estate rather than stylistic innovation. Glazed brick, cast iron, and reinforced concrete began to appear more frequently as construction techniques evolved. The materials and methods came from national building practices, but Seattle's particular climate and market demands shaped how these techniques were applied. The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition of 1909 marked a significant moment in Seattle's architectural consciousness. This World's Fair, held on the University of Washington campus, introduced the city to Beaux-Arts planning principles and sparked a broader awareness of how civic design could shape urban identity. The exposition's influence was less about creating lasting architectural monuments than about introducing planning concepts that influenced how neighborhoods would develop in the decades that followed. After the exposition closed, the fairgrounds transformed into the permanent campus of the University of Washington, and the Beaux-Arts principles evident in its layout influenced subsequent development patterns throughout the city. Wide boulevards, planned green spaces, and hierarchical arrangements of buildings became ideals that, while not always realized, shaped how planners thought about growth. The 1920s and 1930s saw the construction of Seattle's first true skyscrapers, though by national standards, these remained modest in height. The Smith Tower, completed in 1914, stood as the city's tallest building for decades. These early vertical structures were built during a period of commercial confidence that coincided with the opening of the Panama Canal, which enhanced Seattle's strategic importance as a Pacific port. The architectural language of these buildings drew from Art Deco and the so-called Chicago School of Commercial Architecture. Yet Seattle's climate and local materials influenced their execution. The region's abundant timber meant that frame construction continued to play a role even in multi-story buildings. While local stone and brick suppliers influenced material choices, the result was a distinctive Seattle commercial. Vernacular, ambitious in height, but grounded in practical regional considerations. The Great Depression slowed construction dramatically, and during the 1930s and early 1940s, Seattle's architectural evolution was marked more by the absence of new building than by innovation. The Works Progress Administration did fund some civic and public building projects during this period, leaving a small collection of Art Deco and Art Moderne structures that reflected federal design sensibilities. More significantly, the economic stagnation meant that early 20th century neighborhoods became fixed in their architectural character. Residential districts that had developed around the turn-of-the-century areas like Capitol Hill, Fremont, and Ballard took on a relatively stable form during this period. With modest single-family homes, small apartment buildings, and local commercial strips forming the neighborhood structure, World War II transformed Seattle's economy and its physical landscape. The city became a major center for aircraft manufacturing and shipbuilding, particularly around the facilities of Boeing and the shipyards. This industrial surge brought rapid population growth and created unprecedented demand for housing and infrastructure. The period from 1945 to 1960 saw the development of new residential neighborhoods on the city's periphery, built to house workers and returning military personnel. These neighborhoods reflected the architectural ideals of mid-century suburban development, single-family homes on small lots, connected by new streetcar and bus lines, with modest neighborhood commercial centers. Design trends indicate that these homes, though often dismissed as generic suburban housing, embodied rational planning principles and reflected genuine attempts to provide affordable housing for working families, parallel to suburban growth. Downtown Seattle underwent transformation in the 1960s and 1970s. Urban renewal policies, which were being implemented in cities across the nation, led to the demolition of older buildings and the construction of modernist replacement structures. The Smith Tower and other early commercial buildings stood alongside newly constructed glass and steel office towers. The Pike Place Market, nearly demolished during this period, was instead preserved and partially renovated, becoming an early example of adaptive reuse and heritage preservation thinking. The decision to retain the market, despite pressure to redevelop the waterfront for commercial purposes, reflected shifting attitudes about the value of historic preservation. Architectural historians note that this period marked a transition in how the city viewed its past, no longer something to be rapidly replaced, but something worth retaining and adapting to new uses. The 1980s and 1990s brought a new era of economic growth, centered on technology industries, finance, and international trade. This period saw continued development of the downtown core with postmodern and contemporary commercial architecture replacing earlier structures, yet this growth was not uniform. Many neighborhoods from the early 20th century remained relatively unchanged, their architectural character intact. The relative abundance of early 20th century residential and commercial buildings, many of which had been overlooked during earlier urban renewal periods, became recognized as a cultural asset. This recognition led to increased preservation activity and the designation of historic districts in neighborhoods like Pioneer Square and Capitol Hill. The adaptive reuse of older buildings for new purposes, lofts and converted warehouses, offices and former hotels, retail and historic storefronts became a significant element of Seattle's urban development strategy. The architectural landscape of contemporary Seattle reflects the accumulated layers of these different periods. The downtown skyline includes Smith Tower, alongside glass towers of recent construction. Historic neighborhoods preserve the character of their periods of development while accommodating modern uses. Waterfront areas that were once devoted solely to industrial uses have been partially transformed into mixed-use development. The broader question of how to manage growth while preserving character has become a central concern in planning discussions. Seattle's architecture is not defined by a single period or style, but by the visible remains of the different historical conditions and economic imperatives that shape the city's growth. The city's current architectural landscape serves as a record of how geography, economics, technology, and community values have shifted over time. The wooden structures that replaced early log buildings, the masonry commercial blocks that rose after the 1889 fire, the early 20th century neighborhoods that still house much of the city's population, and the modernist and contemporary structures of recent decades all remain visible. This layered architecture tells the story of a working city that was repeatedly reshaped by its relationship to resource extraction, maritime trade, manufacturing, and now information technology and services. The early pragmatic approach to building that characterized frontier Seattle never entirely disappeared. Even as the city has grown and modernized, there remains an emphasis on functional design and rational urban planning that echoes the practical values of the city's origins. The architecture of Seattle is ultimately the architecture of adaptation, a record of how a particular place, shaped by its geography and history, has continuously rebuilt itself in response to changing circumstances.